He believed black people were born to be owned. He saw fear as the only language they understood. He was certain his land, his power, and his family were untouchable. That certainty shattered the day he discovered that one of his slaves was in love with his daughter, and that she loved him back. The plantation had been designed to look calm. From the main road, visitors saw symmetry, long rows of cotton stretching evenly toward the tree line, fences standing straight, buildings placed with intention. The White House sat slightly elevated, not by accident but by design. It was meant to be seen first. Everything else existed beneath it, physically, socially, morally. Silence ruled the land, not peaceful silence, but the kind that comes from knowing when not to speak. The master valued that silence above all else. He had inherited the plantation from his father, who had inherited it from his own. By the time it became his, cruelty no longer felt like a choice. It felt like responsibility. Order had to be maintained. Fear, when controlled, kept the system running smoothly. He told himself this often, especially when he walked the fields and saw eyes drop before he spoke. He did not consider himself a monster. Monsters, in his mind, were chaotic, emotional, excessive. He was none of those things. He was measured, practical, efficient. Punishment was never personal, it was instructional. Pain was simply one of many tools. The enslaved people on his land understood that distinction instinctively. They knew his footsteps by sound alone. They could tell his mood by the way he paused before speaking. They learned which mistakes earned correction and which earned suffering. Survival depended on reading him correctly. Among them was a young man named Isaiah. Isaiah had been born on the plantation, his life beginning under rules already written. He had no memory of freedom, only stories passed quietly between older hands when night softened the edges of the day. He worked near the house more often than most, repairing fences, tending horses, carrying supplies. Work close to the master required discipline. One wrong look, one misunderstood gesture could be fatal. Isaiah learned early how to disappear while standing in plain sight. That was why the first moment caught him off guard. He was in the stable yard, tightening a loose hinge on one of the doors, when a shadow crossed the ground beside him. He did not look up at first. He assumed it was another hand passing through, or a rider returning early. Then a voice spoke. "Is the bay horse ready?" It was not a command. That alone made it unusual. Isaiah hesitated before answering. He straightened slowly, careful not to move too quickly, and kept his eyes lowered. "Yes, miss," he said. She stood a few feet away, holding a book against her chest. Her posture relaxed in a way that only the protected could afford. She was young, perhaps 18 or 19, dressed neatly, her hair pulled back without much thought. The master's daughter. Isaiah's chest tightened. He should not be this close. He should not be speaking this much. He should not be noticed at all. She studied the horse briefly, then looked at him again. "What's your name?" she asked. No one ever asked names unless they intended to use them. "Isaiah," he replied quietly. She nodded as if committing it to memory, then thanked him and walked away. That should have been the end of it. On plantations like this, moments did not linger. They passed forgotten, absorbed back into routine. But days later she returned. And then again. Sometimes she came with questions about the horses. Other times she brought excuses so thin they barely justified her presence. A dropped ribbon, a need for water, a curiosity about work she had never shown before. Isaiah answered carefully, always respectfully, never more than necessary. He kept space between them, physical and otherwise. Yet he could feel something shifting in the air when she lingered too long or smiled without reason. Her name, he learned eventually, was Margaret. Margaret had grown up believing the plantation was normal. Slavery had been explained to her as a fact of life, like weather or seasons, something unfortunate perhaps but necessary. She had been taught kindness but not equality, sympathy but not challenge. Isaiah unsettled her because he did not fit the stories she had been given. He was quiet but not dull, careful but not broken. When he spoke, there was restraint in his voice, not ignorance. She began to notice the way he watched the ground instead of her face, the way his hands stilled when footsteps approached. One afternoon she asked where he was born. "Here," he answered. "Have you ever left?" she asked. He shook his head. Something about that answer stayed with her. Their conversations remained brief, often interrupted. They never touched, never even stood too close. Everything about the plantation warned against it. Yet intimacy formed anyway, not through contact but through attention. Isaiah knew better than to believe it meant safety. He had seen what happened when boundaries blurred. The master noticed the change before he understood its cause. Margaret spent more time outside. She asked questions that carried unnecessary detail. She lingered in places she had never lingered before. None of it was openly defiant, but it unsettled him. Curiosity, when left unchecked, led to disorder. He instructed overseers to keep a closer watch. He adjusted Isaiah's tasks, moving him more frequently, testing how easily he could be controlled. Small pressures, subtle reminders. Isaiah felt it immediately. His workdays grew longer. Oversight increased. Mistakes that once earned silence now earned sharp correction. He said nothing. Complaints were invitations to punishment. Margaret noticed too. She asked why Isaiah looked exhausted, why his hands were raw. He deflected carefully, but concern had already taken root in her. Concern on this land was dangerous. Neither of them spoke of love. Not yet. The word itself felt forbidden, too large to survive in the open. What existed between them was quieter, a shared awareness that something was growing in a place it was not allowed to exist, and somewhere in the house above them, a man who believed his control was absolute was beginning to sense that something on his land no longer belonged to him. The master did not confront what he suspected right away. He had learned long ago that haste weakened authority. Power worked best when it appeared patient, when it allowed people to believe they were unseen. Patterns always revealed more than accusations, so he watched. From the upper floor of the house, he observed the yard at different hours. He noted who crossed it often, and who seemed to slow without reason. He paid attention to where his daughter walked, when she thought no one cared. Enough to notice. Margaret felt the weight of his attention before she understood it. Her father had always been observant, but now his questions changed shape. They were no longer casual. They carried edges. He asked why she preferred walking instead of riding, why she lingered near the stables, why she seemed distracted during meals. She answered carefully. She had grown up knowing the cost of defiance. Still, something inside her resisted retreat. Each question forced her to see how narrow her freedom truly was. Isaiah experienced the change differently. His assignments began to shift without explanation. Some days he was pulled closer to the house than before. Other days he was sent far into the fields with work that served no real purpose. Overseers watched him longer than necessary. Orders came faster and with less patience. One afternoon, he was sent to repair a fence at the far edge of the land under the full heat of the sun. The fence was intact. He understood immediately that the task itself was irrelevant. He worked anyway. By the time he returned to the quarters that night, his hands were trembling with exhaustion. He washed them quietly and said nothing. Complaints did not travel upward here. They were buried with the people who voiced them. Margaret noticed his absence the next morning. She went to the stables and found someone else tending the horses. When she asked about Isaiah, the man avoided her eyes and gave an answer that explained nothing. That unsettled her. Later that day, she saw Isaiah near the fields, working alone. He straightened when he noticed her and stepped back instinctively, increasing the space between them. She should not have gone closer. She knew that. Still, she did. His face looked different, tighter, worn in a way she had not seen before. She understood then that attention itself could be a weapon. Their exchange was brief and careful. Few words, long pauses. Isaiah made it clear without saying it directly that her presence placed him in danger. The realization sat heavily with her. For the first time, guilt replaced curiosity. The master noticed enough that afternoon to be certain. He saw the way Margaret slowed when she noticed Isaiah, the way her posture changed, the way Isaiah stiffened when she appeared. It was subtle, too subtle for anyone who was not already looking for it. Expectation sharpened perception. That evening, Isaiah was summoned to the house. The order came without explanation. Those were always the most dangerous. Isaiah cleaned himself as best he could before approaching the back entrance. He kept his eyes lowered as he waited to be admitted. The house felt colder than usual, quieter. Every sound carried farther than it should have. The master studied him for a long moment. Isaiah stood still. He had learned that movement invited interpretation. The master spoke calmly. He asked about Isaiah's work, about his duties, about where he spent his time during the day. Isaiah answered carefully. He chose each word as if it might be weighed later. The questions narrowed. The master asked about his daughter. Isaiah felt the shift immediately. His chest tightened, but his face remained neutral. He answered with restraint. He spoke only of tasks, of obedience, of distance. The master listened. Then he leaned back slightly, considering. He reminded Isaiah of his position, of the order of things, of the consequences that followed confusion. There was no shouting, no punishment. Isaiah was dismissed. That restraint was deliberate. Fear without pain lingered longer. Margaret confronted her father later that night. Not openly. She was not reckless. She asked about Isaiah's workload, about why his assignments kept changing, about whether fairness mattered at all. Her father listened patiently. Then he spoke of kindness as if it were a flaw, as if mercy weakened structure, as if concern invited chaos. Something inside her shifted at that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quiet fractures often spread the farthest. After that, her movements became more careful. Meetings between her and Isaiah grew rarer and more dangerous. They spoke only when unavoidable. Sometimes not at all. The absence itself became heavy. Each time they saw one another from a distance, restraint felt unbearable. What they did not say pressed harder than anything spoken aloud. One evening near dusk, chance betrayed them. A sudden storm scattered the yard. Work halted. Most retreated for cover. Isaiah was securing equipment when Margaret appeared, drenched, having taken the longer path back from her walk. They froze when they saw each other. For a moment neither moved. The rain softened the world around them. Sound dulled. The plantation seemed distant, almost unreal. They spoke quietly, carefully. Each, aware that even the air could carry consequences. Margaret admitted what she had not allowed herself to name before, that she did not know how to make the feeling stop. That restraint only seemed to sharpen it. Isaiah listened with his eyes lowered. When he spoke, his voice was steady. He told her that some things were decided the moment they were recognized, that her choices were not the same as his, that the cost would never be equal. The truth of that settled heavily between them. She reached out without thinking, then stopped herself before touching him. The space between them felt louder than any contact could have been. That was when the master chose to intervene openly. The next morning, Isaiah was reassigned permanently to the far fields. No explanation was offered. No discussion allowed. The distance was deliberate. The separation absolute. The work was harsher. The hours longer. Supervision constant. Margaret protested. This time she did not disguise it. Her father's response was calm, final. He told her that she would forget this. That time corrected confusion. That order mattered more than feeling. She realized then that his concern was not for Isaiah, not even for her. It was for control. That understanding changed her. And in the fields beyond the house, Isaiah worked under the sun, aware that what had begun quietly was now being crushed with intent. Neither of them said the word love. They did not need to. It was already being punished. The reassignment was not meant to be temporary. Isaiah understood that the first morning he was sent to the far fields before sunrise. The walk alone took longer than his previous workday had ever begun. By the time he arrived, the overseer was already waiting, arms folded, expression unreadable. The work there was different. It was not simply harder. It was designed to erase. The sun bore down without interruption. Water was rationed more tightly. Breaks shortened. Mistakes were noted publicly. Correction came quickly. This part of the land existed for one purpose, to remind. Isaiah adjusted the way he always had. He kept his head down. He worked steadily. He did not look toward the house even when it was visible in the distance, pale against the trees. But distance did not erase memory. At night, exhaustion dulled his body but sharpened his thoughts. He replayed moments he wished he could forget. Her face when she realized what her attention had cost him. The way she had stopped herself from touching him. The space that had held more meaning than any contact. He told himself it had to end. That whatever had formed between them had no place here. That survival required forgetting. The mind does not obey commands so easily. Margaret felt the separation immediately. The yard felt empty in a way she could not explain to anyone else. She found herself watching the paths out of habit, then stopping when she remembered there was no reason to look. Meals tasted dull. Conversations drifted past her without landing. Her father noticed the quiet. He mistook it for acceptance. He believed time had already begun to correct the problem. Margaret did not argue. She did not ask questions. She learned to perform obedience the way she had been taught. That made him comfortable. Comfort to him meant success. What he did not see was how closely she began to observe everything else. She noticed how the work changed when she was nearby. How voices dropped. How backs straightened. How fear reshaped the air. She noticed how easily cruelty hid inside routine. And she noticed Isaiah. Not directly. Not openly. She began to take longer walks that passed near the distant fields. She positioned herself where she could see movement without being seen. Sometimes she caught a glimpse of him bent under the sun, thinner already than he had been weeks before. Each time something tightened inside her chest. One afternoon she saw him stumble. It was brief, almost invisible, the kind of moment that vanished unless you were already looking for it. He caught himself quickly and continued working. No one else reacted. Margaret stopped walking. She stood there longer than she should have, long enough to be noticed. An overseer glanced toward her, then looked away. No one approached her. They did not need to. The message was clear. She returned to the house shaken. That evening she asked her father about the far fields. She asked casually. As if it were curiosity, not concern, she asked about yields, about labor efficiency, about why the work there seemed so severe. Her father answered without hesitation. Hard work built character. Structure required firmness. Weakness spread if left uncorrected. He spoke as if reciting facts. Margaret listened and felt something settle into place. This was not misunderstanding. This was intention. That night she did not sleep. She sat by the window and watched the land disappear into darkness. She thought about the stories she had been told growing up. About order. About necessity. About how suffering had always been explained as distant and abstract. Now it had a face. Isaiah did not know she was watching. He only knew that the days were becoming harder to endure. His body adapted, but his spirit did not. The work was endless. The supervision constant. He was never alone long enough to rest his thoughts. The overseer spoke to him less and watched him more. Silence here carried its own threat. One afternoon, as the sun began to lower, an overseer approached him slowly. The man did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke in a calm voice that carried certainty. Isaiah was told that mistakes had been reported. That concern had been raised. That confusion, if left unchecked, led to consequences. Isaiah listened. He nodded. He said nothing. The overseer leaned closer. He reminded Isaiah that distance was not forgiveness, that eyes reached farther than fences, that correction could always be adjusted. Isaiah understood. That night his hands shook as he tried to eat. He forced the food down anyway. Hunger was another tool here. In the house, Margaret made a decision she did not yet fully understand. She began to write. At first, it was harmless. Notes, observations, details about the land and the work. She told herself it was curiosity, a way to make sense of what she was seeing. But the writing changed. She began recording names, conditions, hours, punishments she overheard but had never questioned before. She wrote about Isaiah, though never by name. She described his work, his exhaustion, the way he had faded under deliberate pressure. She hid the pages carefully. Secrecy felt dangerous, but silence felt worse. Days passed. The master remained satisfied. The separation had worked. Disorder had been removed from sight. His daughter had grown quieter, more compliant. The enslaved man had been relocated and corrected, control restored. That was when he noticed the change he had not anticipated. Margaret began asking different questions. Not about Isaiah, not about the fields, but about law, about inheritance, about property rights, about documents he had not expected her to care about. He answered her, amused at first, then cautious. Curiosity redirected could still be dangerous. One evening, as he reviewed records in his study, he noticed a discrepancy. A small one, a number that did not align. He traced it back through the books. It led nowhere, and yet it unsettled him. Order depended on precision. Meanwhile, Isaiah collapsed in the fields, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded immediate response. His knees buckled. His hands hit the dirt. He stayed there longer than was permitted. The overseer approached. Isaiah forced himself upright before a word could be spoken. His vision blurred, but he steadied himself. He resumed working. The punishment came anyway. That night, Margaret learned what had happened. Not through words, through posture, through the way people moved when something had gone wrong, through the silence that followed. She understood then that restraint alone would not protect him. And far from the house that claimed ownership over everything beneath it, Isaiah reached the edge of what his body could endure, unaware that the quiet defiance growing above him was about to collide with the cruelty below. The plantation remained silent, but silence, when stretched too far, begins to crack. The collapse changed nothing on paper. Work continued the next morning as it always had. The sun rose. Orders were given. Bodies moved where they were told to move. The plantation did not acknowledge weakness unless it could be turned into an example. Isaiah was slower after that day. Not enough to stop working, not enough to invite immediate punishment, just enough that every movement required intention. Each breath felt earned rather than automatic. He learned to pace himself differently, saving strength for moments that mattered. Pain became background noise. What unsettled him more was the attention. The overseers watched him with a patience that felt deliberate, not waiting for improvement, waiting for failure. He understood the logic. If he broke publicly, it would justify everything that followed. So he did not break. Margaret noticed the change from a distance. Isaiah's movements were smaller now, more contained. He no longer straightened as quickly when orders were given. The strength she had once mistaken for calm had thinned into endurance. She stopped pretending this was coincidence. Her writing became more focused. She no longer recorded impressions. She documented patterns, dates, conditions. She copied passages from her father's books when they aligned with what she saw. Outside laws, transactions, language that reduced people to figures. She began to understand how cruelty survived without shouting. One afternoon, she followed her father into his study uninvited. He did not object. That alone surprised her. She asked about ownership, about whether land and people were truly the same under the law. She asked whether inheritance included lives as easily as it included acres. Her father answered calmly. He had answered these questions before for men who mattered. He spoke of tradition, of economy, of responsibility, of how order required firm hands. He framed control as burden rather than benefit. Margaret listened. She did not argue. That unsettled him more than defiance would have. In the fields, Isaiah received a warning. It was not delivered with threats. It was delivered with routine. An overseer adjusted his workload again, increased it slightly, just enough to test him. Isaiah understood the message. Compliance was being measured. Limits were being mapped. He pushed himself harder. At night, his dreams shifted. They no longer carried hope. They carried memory, the sound of rain, the space between his hand and hers, the brief belief that something unseen might still exist. He woke each morning before the bell. Margaret found a way to speak to him again. It was not planned. It was not safe. It was necessary. She walked near the fields, under the pretense of inspecting the land. She kept her posture relaxed, her pace steady. When Isaiah saw her, he did not look up. She stopped anyway. They did not face one another. She spoke quietly. Not his name. Not anything that could be repeated. She told him she was sorry. The word felt small once spoken. Isaiah said nothing. She told him she saw what was happening. That she understood more than before. That she was not blind anymore. Isaiah told her it was dangerous for her to be there. She said danger already existed. They did not stay long. They did not say what they wanted to say. They separated without touching. That was enough to be noticed. The master sensed the shift that evening. Not through reports, through absence. His daughter returned later than expected. Her attention felt divided. Her silence was sharper. He began to check his records more often. He reviewed assignments, oversight schedules. He made small adjustments, increased supervision in places that did not require it. Control tightened. Isaiah was called forward in front of others 2 days later. The accusation was vague. Carelessness, delay, lack of discipline. He accepted it without protest. The punishment was not severe. That was intentional. It was visible, measured, a reminder. Margaret saw it. She did not look away. That was her mistake. Her father noticed her reaction immediately. Not outrage, not tears. Something colder, something resolved. That night he confronted her, not with anger, with disappointment. He spoke of shame, of boundaries, of how proximity corrupted judgment. He reminded her of who she was and what she represented. Margaret listened. Then she asked a question he had not prepared for. She asked whether ownership erased responsibility, whether authority justified harm, whether control required cruelty or merely allowed it. Her father answered sharply this time. He told her the world was not built on feelings, that softness invited chaos, that her concern was misguided and dangerous. She did not argue, but she did not retreat either. Isaiah felt the consequences immediately. His workload increased again. His supervision doubled. Rest became a luxury he could not afford. He realized then that what existed between him and Margaret was no longer a private risk. It had become a challenge. Margaret understood it too. She hid her writing more carefully. She began copying documents rather than summarizing them. She memorized names, routes, timings. Her fear shifted shape. It was no longer fear of being discovered. It was fear of being too late. In the fields, Isaiah stood at the edge of his endurance. In the house above him, a daughter of power began to understand the cost of choosing against it, and the man who ruled them both began to prepare for something he could feel, slipping beyond his control. By the time the master decided to act decisively, he had already convinced himself that restraint had been generosity. In his mind he had been patient. He had corrected quietly. He had adjusted without spectacle. Disorder had been addressed in stages, each one justified by necessity. What troubled him now was not the behavior itself, but the persistence of it. Problems that refused to disappear suggested weakness, and weakness once noticed invited challenge. He began with separation made absolute. Isaiah was moved again, this time to work that kept him beyond Margaret's sight entirely. The farthest fields, the least forgiving soil, tasks that left no room for pause. Overseers were instructed to rotate frequently, ensuring constant scrutiny without familiarity. It was not announced as punishment. It was framed as efficiency. Isaiah understood the meaning immediately. The land there was unforgiving. The soil resisted tools. The sun lingered longer. Water came later than it should. Work ended only when bodies gave out or light failed. Mistakes were no longer corrected. They were accumulated. He adapted as best he could. He rationed his strength. He learned which moments demanded effort and which demanded stillness. He let pain settle into his muscles rather than fighting it. What he could not control was isolation. Days passed without a familiar face. Nights passed without voices that reminded him he still existed beyond labor. The world narrowed to dirt, heat and commands delivered without names. In that silence, memory became both refuge and threat. Margaret felt the absence like a physical wound. She no longer caught glimpses of Isaiah during her walks. The fields she could see from the house held different figures now. Strangers bent under the same sun. She realized how easily people could vanish here without explanation. Her father noticed her restlessness and misread it. He believed removal had worked. Margaret no longer protested openly. She no longer asked questions that led nowhere. She appeared subdued, attentive, obedient. She attended meals. She listened when spoken to. She returned to the routines expected of her. That performance required effort. In private, she worked harder than she ever had before. Her writing became precise. She stopped recording emotion entirely. She focused on facts, schedules, transactions. She traced the movement of people, the way her father traced the movement of goods. She learned how easily records erased suffering by omitting it. She discovered discrepancies, names that appeared once and never again, numbers that changed without explanation, transfers justified by vague language that hid intent behind efficiency. She realized then that cruelty did not rely on anger, it relied on paperwork. One evening she found a ledger that did not belong where it had been left. It contained older entries written in a hand she did not recognize, notes about discipline, about examples made, about compliance restored. The language was clinical. She closed the book slowly and returned it to its place. That night, she understood something that frightened her. Her father did not merely allow cruelty. He organized it. In the fields, Isaiah reached a breaking point that did not announce itself. There was no collapse this time. No stumble. No visible failure. His body continued moving, even as something inside him began to retreat. Hunger dulled. Thirst became distant. Pain flattened into a constant pressure that required no attention. He worked without expectation. That was what frightened him most. One afternoon, an overseer noticed the change. Isaiah's pace had become steady but empty. His eyes no longer reacted quickly. His responses came slower, as if delayed. The overseer reported this. Concern was noted. Correction was adjusted. That night, Isaiah was denied rest. He was kept moving longer than the others. Not violently, methodically. The purpose was not punishment. It was demonstration. Margaret felt the consequences without knowing the details. She sensed it in the way the house felt heavier, in the way servants avoided certain paths, in the way silence stretched longer before settling. She confronted her father again, not with accusation, with logic. She asked about productivity, about diminishing returns, about whether excessive pressure truly maintained order or simply consumed it. Her father listened and answered sharply. He told her she was thinking like someone who had never been responsible for consequence. That mercy was a luxury built on control, that the world rewarded firmness, not hesitation. Margaret realized then that persuasion would not work. What followed was not dramatic. It was quiet resolve. She began to prepare. She copied documents in full. She memorized routes off the land. She learned which people could move unnoticed and which could not. She stopped writing feelings altogether and focused on outcomes. She knew she could not save everyone. That knowledge settled heavily. Isaiah sensed change without understanding its source. One night, as he returned to the quarters barely conscious with exhaustion, he found a small parcel hidden where he rested his tools, food, clean cloth, water. No explanation. He knew better than to ask. The parcel appeared again 2 nights later. Then again. Hope arrived cautiously. Hope was dangerous. He ate sparingly. He hid what he could not consume. He waited. Margaret never approached him again. She did not risk visibility. She understood that proximity now would destroy any chance of impact. Her work moved elsewhere. She sought out people her father dismissed, clerks, traders, men, who handled goods but avoided responsibility for how those goods were produced. She listened. She remembered. She learned which names carried weight beyond the plantation. The master sensed movement he could not locate. Records felt unsettled. Routines shifted subtly. The land still obeyed him, but something beneath it no longer felt stable. He responded the way he always had. He tightened control. Restrictions increased. Surveillance expanded. He justified it as prevention. Isaiah felt the pressure immediately. One morning, an overseer informed him that his behavior had been noted. That improvement was expected. That confusion had consequences. Isaiah said nothing. Silence here was survival. Margaret felt time narrowing. She realized that waiting for the right moment was another form of permission. That restraint, too long maintained, became complicity. The final incident came without warning. An older man in the far fields collapsed. This time he did not rise. The overseers delayed response. Work continued around him until it was impossible to ignore. By the time attention arrived, it was too late. The body was removed quietly. No announcement followed, no pause in routine, no acknowledgement. Margaret watched from a distance and felt something harden inside her. That night she made her decision. Isaiah learned of the death, hours later, through whispers that carried fear more than information. He understood then that survival alone was no longer enough. He did not know what was coming. He only knew that the land had crossed a line that could not be unseen. Above him, in the house built to command everything beneath it, a daughter prepared to betray the system that had raised her, and the man who ruled. Them all remained unaware that the control he valued most was already unraveling from within. The decision Margaret made did not feel brave. It felt necessary. Bravery suggested choice. What she felt was pressure closing from every side. Waiting had become another form of harm. Silence had started to feel like participation. The plantation continued because everyone who benefited from it allowed it to continue. She understood now that understanding alone changed nothing. The first step was distance. She stopped appearing where she had no reason to be. She reduced her walks. She avoided the windows that overlooked the fields. To anyone watching, she seemed to have returned to herself, quiet, proper, contained. Her father relaxed. That worried her more than his suspicion ever had. She used that comfort. Margaret began arranging visits under the pretense of family, obligation, relatives, business acquaintances, men who dealt in trade and law, and rarely questioned how profit arrived at their doors. She listened carefully when they spoke. She paid attention to which names carried authority beyond the land. She learned that distance softened cruelty. People were willing to discuss morality once it was no longer visible. Isaiah sensed the shift before he understood it. The parcels stopped coming. Not abruptly, gradually, as if the hand that had provided them had moved elsewhere. He did not panic. He had learned not to rely on mercy. He adjusted again. He worked, he endured. What changed was the tone of the oversight. Orders became sharper, observation constant. The overseers no longer corrected him quietly. They wanted response, reaction, evidence that pressure still worked. Isaiah gave them nothing. His silence frustrated them. Silence that did not break threatened the system more than defiance ever could. One afternoon, an overseer struck him without warning. It was not severe. Not enough to cause lasting damage. Just enough to provoke. Isaiah staggered and caught himself. He did not raise his head. He did not respond. That restraint unsettled the man who had struck him. Punishment relied on recognition. Without it, cruelty lost its shape. The report traveled upward anyway. The master reviewed it without emotion. He approved increased supervision. Longer hours, less rest. He reminded himself that firmness now prevented chaos later. That order required sacrifice, that he bore the burden of maintaining it. He did not consider whose burden it truly was. Margaret began moving pieces quietly. She shared documents with people who had no reason to defend her father. Men who disliked him for reasons unrelated to morality, rivals, competitors, officials, whose authority rested on law rather than land. She did not ask for justice. She presented information, numbers, records, testimony gathered without names attached, evidence that suggested inefficiency, liability, risk. Risk mattered. Concern arrived slowly. Questions followed. The master noticed the first, signed when a routine shipment was delayed without explanation. Then another. Then correspondence arrived with unfamiliar language, careful, legal, distant. He felt irritation first, then unease. Control depended on predictability. Margaret watched his reaction from a distance. She did not celebrate. She did not feel relief. She understood this was only the beginning. The land did not release its grip easily. Isaiah learned of change through absence. One morning an overseer did not arrive. Work paused longer than usual. Instructions came late. Supervision thinned. That kind of inconsistency meant something. Whispers spread carefully. Not hope, suspicion. Later that day, Isaiah was moved again. Not farther, closer, not to the house. To a neutral section of the land where attention was divided. The reason was not given. He accepted the change without comment. Hope, when visible, invited punishment. Margaret learned that outside pressure provoked inside cruelty. Her father tightened his hold on what remained fully his. He reviewed assignments personally. He authorized harsher correction. He framed it as protection. He told himself he was restoring balance. Margaret saw it for what it was. Fear. She confronted him once more. Not emotionally, not morally. She spoke of consequence. She spoke of scrutiny, of outside attention, of how quickly systems collapsed. When they were exposed to light, they had not been built to endure. Her father listened and dismissed it. He accused her of hysteria, of naivety, of misunderstanding how the world worked. He told her she would regret interference. That night, Margaret understood that exposure would not soften him. It would corner him. Isaiah felt the consequences the next day. A mistake was recorded that he had not made. The response was immediate, public, designed to reassert authority. He endured it without resistance. What he could not endure was the realization that others suffered because he did. Isolation had failed. Now example was being used. Margaret learned of it through the silence that followed. She did not cry. She did not confront. She acted. She sent copies of records beyond the region, beyond the influence of men who benefited from the plantation. She reached people who saw scandal as opportunity, who understood that exposure created leverage. The master sensed the shift before proof arrived. Visitors behaved differently. Conversations felt guarded. People who had once deferred now asked questions that lingered too long. He responded with confidence. Confidence, when challenged, hardened into rigidity. Isaiah was summoned again. This time there was no pretense of correction. He was reminded of his place, of consequences, of how easily order erased individuals. He listened. He said nothing. That silence infuriated the men who stood before him. The master authorized transfer, not sale, removal. Isaiah would be sent away, disappeared into another system where his name would not matter and his history would dissolve into labor. The decision was recorded quickly. Margaret discovered it by chance. A line in a ledger, a note without detail, a movement scheduled soon. She understood what removal meant. It was erasure. She acted without permission. She confronted her father with the evidence she had gathered, with the names she had contacted, with the documents that no longer belonged solely to him. She did not plead. She stated facts. Her father reacted with disbelief first, then anger, then calculation. He realized then that the challenge did not come from below. It came from within his own house. He threatened her with consequence, with isolation, with removal of protection. Margaret accepted the risk. She understood that safety had always been conditional. Isaiah felt the shift that night. The air changed, not lighter, sharper. He was moved again. This time, not under guard, not with explanation. He was placed where eyes watched but did not intervene. Something was unfolding beyond him. He did not know if it would end in relief or destruction. The plantation did not sleep. Neither did the man who ruled it. Control, once questioned, demanded response. And response, when driven by fear, often arrived too late. The master did not sleep that night. He walked the length of his house slowly, room by room, as if inspecting damage after a storm. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. And yet the structure no longer felt secure. The floors still held his weight, but they no longer reassured him. The walls stood firm, but they listened now. Even the silence had changed its character. It was no longer obedient. It lingered, heavy and observant. For most of his life, silence had meant success. Silence meant work continued. Silence meant no resistance worth naming. Silence meant order. This silence felt different. By dawn, he had convinced himself that the situation could still be managed. So it always had been. Systems did not collapse because of sentiment. They survived emotion. They survived scandal. What they did not survive was hesitation, and he had no intention of hesitating. He summoned Margaret just after sunrise. She arrived composed, not defiant, not frightened. That composure unsettled him more than tears would have. He motioned for her to sit. She remained standing. He allowed it. He wanted control, not conflict. He spoke carefully. He framed his words as guidance. He reminded her of her upbringing, of the privileges she had never questioned, of the responsibilities she carried simply by existing under his roof. He told her she had mistaken proximity for understanding, that she had confused suffering she observed with suffering she knew. He told her the world functioned because someone made hard decisions. Margaret listened without interrupting. Then she told him she had already shared everything she had documented. Not opinions, not impressions, records, dates, names, transactions, conditions. She told him it no longer belonged to either of them. For a moment he thought he had misheard her. The idea did not fit inside his understanding of authority. Information moved upward. Control moved downward. That was how it had always worked. Anger followed confusion, but not explosively. It settled into him like ice. He informed her that Isaiah would be removed immediately, that her actions had consequences she could not shield him from, that whatever sense of righteousness she felt would not prevent reality from asserting itself. Margaret did not argue. She told him he was already being watched. That was the moment he understood that his power had shifted from certainty to performance. Visitors arrived that afternoon. They did not ask permission. They did not wait to be impressed. They carried documents that did not originate from his office and authority that did not depend on his recognition. They walked the land without escorts. They asked questions he could not redirect. They spoke to people he had trained never to speak. The master accompanied them, posture intact, voice measured. He explained processes. He justified outcomes. He used language that had protected him for decades. This time it sounded rehearsed. The questions did not stop. Work slowed. Overseers hesitated. The rhythms of the plantation fractured in small, noticeable ways. Authority that relied on certainty faltered once uncertainty entered the system. Isaiah felt it before he understood it. Orders came late. Whispers replaced commands. Eyes tracked movement constantly, unsure where permission now resided. When he was summoned, it was not by familiar faces. A man he did not know addressed him calmly. Isaiah was told to sit, to answer, to take his time. No one struck him. No one rushed him. For the first time in his life, silence was not used against him. He spoke cautiously at first. Habit demanded it. Years of survival had taught him that truth carried risk. But the man listening did not interrupt. He did not dismiss details as irrelevant. He wrote things down. Isaiah felt something unfamiliar take shape beneath the exhaustion. Recognition. Margaret was kept inside the house during this time, not confined by locks, confined by expectation. She was reminded repeatedly that what she had done could not be undone, that consequences would ripple outward, that restraint might still preserve fragments of dignity. She accepted the isolation. Her fear had already passed its most dangerous stage. It had become clarity. The master observed everything from a distance. He watched authority loosen in ways he could not publicly challenge. He was still addressed with courtesy, still deferred to in form, but the tone had changed. Politeness had replaced obedience. Days passed without resolution. That unsettled him deeply. Immediate punishment he could understand. Delay suggested deliberation, and deliberation implied judgment. Isaiah was not returned to the fields. He was moved, questioned again, given water without being asked. Given time, it did not feel like freedom. It felt like transition. The plantation changed quietly over the following months. Oversight increased. Records were requested more frequently. Decisions were no longer made in isolation. Ownership remained on paper, but influence thinned with each inspection. The master aged visibly, not from loss of wealth, not from public disgrace, from erosion. Certainty left him piece by piece. The habits that had once reinforced his dominance no longer produced the same results. Commands required repetition. Compliance arrived slower. Fear became inconsistent. Silence followed him everywhere. Not the silence of submission, the silence of absence. Margaret left when arrangements allowed it. There was no dramatic departure, no final confrontation. She packed quietly and walked out of a house that no longer felt like shelter. She did not see Isaiah again. She carried his existence with her as proof that the world she had inherited was not fixed, only maintained. Isaiah eventually left the land as well, not celebrated, not rescued, released. The word felt inadequate for what followed. Freedom did not arrive fully formed. It arrived fragmented, heavy with memory. The world beyond the plantation did not wait for him to recover. It demanded adaptation immediately. He carried scars that did not fade. He carried discipline that did not dissolve easily. He carried the knowledge that survival had shaped him more deeply than choice ever had. Still he lived. The master remained. The land passed to others. The systems he built were restructured, renamed, softened at the edges. His name appeared less frequently, then rarely, then only in records. He lived long enough to understand what had happened, not through confession, through isolation. He realized that fear had never been loyalty, that obedience achieved through cruelty required constant reinforcement. That silence was not peace, only suppression. And when that suppression lifted even slightly, there was nothing underneath it that belonged to him. He died in a house that no longer responded to his presence. surrounded by records that could no longer defend him, remembered not as he had imagined but as he had been. If this story stayed with you, if it made you sit quietly for a moment, then it did what it was meant to do. Subscribe to the channel for long-form stories about power, cruelty, regret, and consequences that arrive when escape is no longer possible.